Hi, I'm Jeff Gerard with the Concrete Countertop Institute, and I'd like to talk about surface preparation for your concrete before applying Omega Sealer. Preparing your surface properly is really important, and it's essential to achieving good surface bond. The number one reason why most people have problems, especially adhesion failure, is because they don't prepare the surface properly. So what I want to do is show you the right way and the wrong way. These are going to include wet processing techniques and dry techniques. Now, those of you who have read the instructions and really taken the time to understand them recognize that nowhere in the instructions is dry processing mentioned or allowed. All the techniques, whether it's acid etching or hand sanding or diamond honing, are all done wet, and there's a good reason for that, and I'm going to show you exactly why. All right, so let's talk about the concrete I'm going to be showing you. This is 4-day-old concrete. It happens to be Buddy Road's ECC, cast at about a ½ inch thick, at a water cement ratio 0.28. It's got a little color in it just to show the effects of the surface. It was left in the mold for 2 days, and now it's on day 4. Right now what you're seeing is the cast surface against melamine. The melamine was completely bare, no form release on it, just completely bare melamine. So this surface as it is not ready for the sealer. It has to be cleaned. There's residue on it, there's dust of course, and we have to work on the surface to eliminate things like these curing lines which happen in the mold. So what if you just use a 200 grit diamond hand pad? Don't recommend it because you're going to leave scratches. I also don't recommend it because it's slower and it starts to make the concrete a lot smoother. And that's what I'm going to touch on, why dry sanding and dry processing of concrete is not permitted because the concrete's too smooth. Even those few seconds of sanding by hand have significantly changed the surface. Look at how different it looks from here to here. Same grit. That's done wet, that's done dry. So recently I've gotten some tech support calls from folks who are having some adhesion issues. And after asking a few questions about how they prepared the concrete, there was a common factor that kept popping up, and that had to do with using dry processing, either dry sanding with sandpaper or dry polishing with dry diamond discs on bare concrete. And I think the root of their problem stemmed from that, because whenever I've done any kind of wet processing, whether it was acid etching or wet hand sanding or wet honing, I've never ever had any adhesion issues. In fact, all my adhesion tests where you cut through the sealer and put really sticky duct tape and rip it off showed 0 delamination. So surface preparation is everything. Follow the instructions, you won't have issues. If you deviate from the instructions and choose your own path, you're taking all the risks yourself. So if you choose to do something that's outside of the instructions, I strongly recommend that you test these first before you do it on a customer's project, because I can almost guarantee you'll be losing money because you have to go back and fix it and do it the right way the second time. And in some cases, it might be the 3rd or 4th time. So let's see what dry sanding or dry polishing does to concrete. Here I have 220 grit sandpaper. I have these are just regular sandpaper for wood. This is a Merca Abranet 220, just a higher grade sandpaper, and some mesh that you can see through. And I also have 80 grit, something more aggressive. 80 grit Abranet. I'm going to do it by hand with one of these foam backer pads, and I'm going to put the sandpaper on my air sander, the same one I used with the wet processing pad. And then for these diamond pads, these are all 200 grit. There's 3 different styles here. I'm going to use these on a electric polisher, I beg your pardon. I'm getting all tongue-tangulated here, getting excited about this. So these will be done at the same speed on the same concrete. One big benefit of doing wet processing is you're not generating any dust. So you don't have to deal with the silicate dust and the mess and all that. If you're doing dry sanding and dry polishing, you have to have good dust control measures, and at the very, very minimum, wear one of these. Approved mask, dust mask, not just a nuisance mask. A great dust collector, HEPA, all that, very necessary. It's another reason why I don't like to do dry polishing. That's just my opinion. So let's see what it looks like. I'm going to put this on. It's going to be a little hard to understand me, but safety first. Okay, we're going to go for the 80 grit. So one of the big disadvantages of dry polishing or dry sanding is it creates a lot of dust. And that dust not just gets in the air and you have to protect your lungs from it, but it's forced into the surface. And that dust gets stuck underneath the sand surface, right? This happens to have a vacuum attachment and it can suck some of it out. But some of that just gets worked over and over and over again, and it actually starts to burnish the surface. Let me wipe this off. We'll take a look at it. Okay, so the surface is dry, and I don't know if you can see the sheen. It's noticeably shinier, and that's 80 grit. So that surface is getting burnished, becoming a little too smooth for Omega to bond to. The other thing you can notice, you see how much darker it is from the base concrete? Let's compare that to the wet process side. So remember this contrast, it's several shades darker. This is dry sanded, this is untouched. So here we're on the wet process side, so this is wet sanded. This was wet honed with a diamond, with a 200 grit disc on the sander, and this is untouched. So this area, this little area here that's darker, was dry hand honed by hand. So you can see even just this little bit creates a substantially darker surface and shinier surface than the wet side does. So there's going to be a little bit of a sheen, of course, because you're making the surface smoother. But from the sealer standpoint, dry sanding or dry honing is much worse. So we're back over here on the dry sanded side. Why is it darker? I believe because this has polymer in it, just like GFRC has polymer in it. The polymer starts to smear and pick up some of the pigment that's being honed away. So when you're dry sanding or dry honing or dry polishing, you're creating a lot of friction. The concrete gets hot, the cuttings get hot, the sandpaper or the diamond pad gets hot. That softens the polymer and it starts to smear. And you get this darkening effect that you don't get when you use wet polishing because the surface doesn't get wet, or doesn't get hot, I should say. So not only is your concrete going to look different, it's now even less prepared to accept Omega, and you might have more of an adhesion failure, more problems with the sealer peeling off because you prepared the surface wrong. Okay, now I've got the 220 grit sandpaper on it. Let's see what that does. Besides, create a lot of dust and a lot of noise. You can see some of that residue coming off. Let that dry out, and we'll take a look in a second. So what happens if you use 200 grit dry diamond pads? Let's find out. So I have picked this one at random. I'm going to do all three. These are 4-inch dry diamond pads on my Metabo variable speed polisher. It's set at 2,000 RPM. We'll see if that does a good job or not. I'm not an expert at dry polishing by any means, but we'll see how this works. If you go too slow, you're not ejecting any of the cuttings. If you go too fast, you start melting the pad and smearing the resin on it. So we don't want to have any of that. We'd like to have a nice even cut. That's what I'm looking for. So here we go. So you should immediately start to see color change, and look at that shine compared to sanding. That's just really high shine. Okay, that's 200 grit. And I was doing it one-handed with very little pressure. It's not bad, you know, in terms of surface quality. There's a few swirl marks, but the sealer will take care of that. That's not a problem. It's how shiny it is. Look at how smooth that is. You're never going to get a good bond with that. Okay, I've got this guy on there. That speed seemed to be pretty good. Okay, this is not a lesson in how to dry polish. I was trying to push down a little harder to get more cutting pressure, which is what you need. And you can see how I'm getting a much better cut here than here. This was just really the weight of the polisher. It was there's not enough downward pressure on this one. But again, look at the sheen. Far, far too shiny. Again, 200 grit. Let's try that last one. This one. This is made for marble, so it's like electroplated diamond. Again, this was with a little bit more downward pressure, as much as I could do with one hand and control both the camera and the polisher. But again, far too shiny. That's way too smooth. Omega will not stick to that. So if you're doing this to your concrete, thinking this is good, it's not. You're gonna have problems. Don't dry sand or dry polish.